Okay, welcome back, everybody. Sorry, I was a couple minutes after I said I'd be. I was setting up a caucus line and doing a couple things to get ready for the next meeting. So let me first say, let me welcome the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Bluefish Board for a joint meeting today to finalize the Bluefish Allocation and Rebuilding Amendment. Chris Batsavage, who is the board chair, will be co-chairing with me today. And as we've done many times in the past, given the nature of this FMP and the joint nature of this FMP, we are looking for joint action by both the board and the commission. I'm sorry, but by the board and the council as we move through the alternative sets for finalization of this amendment. And so I'll be asking as we move through for motions by both the board and the council, like motions that we can vote on. And we'll work through the next few hours. This is on the agenda until 3 o'clock today. I'd like to try to stick to that agenda as best we can. And we'll see how things go. So trying to think if there's any other things that we need to bring up. We'll certainly have an opportunity for the board to caucus before voting. And I guess I will say that as we've done in the past, I'll try to keep track, and Chris, maybe you can help me as well. We'll alternate back and forth between the council voting first and the board voting first. So as motions are made, we'll just jump back and forth to get those votes, so that way one body is not voting first all the time. I think that's worked best in the past, and we'll try to do that the best we can here today. I just want to remind everybody that this is a joint plan, and under that umbrella, we really need to stick together and work as partners, both the commission and the council, in finding some solutions for this amendment. So does anyone have any questions before we start? Chris, did you have anything you might want to add before we get going here this morning?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think you covered the meeting logistics really well. Just kind of thinking back, this action started in December 2017 to review and possibly revise the allocation between the commercial and recreational fisheries and the commercial allocations to the states. But since then, we received new MRIP estimates and a stock assessment that determined the stock is overfished, which extended the timeline of the amendment. But this information has given us a better understanding of the landings compared to the allocations in the FMP. And has made stock rebuilding and management priority. So I look forward to the board and council's deliberations today and final actions. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. And we were considering some final actions on other amendments in the recent past, which were postponed. However, given the rebuilding portion of this amendment and the stock status of Bluefish, there really is no time for delay. I mean, I would really hope, and I guess it'll come out in the wash as we discuss this, but I'm really hoping for final action today on this amendment. So with that said, I'm going to turn the presentation over to staff. We have Matt Seeley and with the council staff and Dustin learning with the commission, who I think are going to tag team this presentation a bit. And so I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thanks for being here with us today, and we'll look forward to your presentation, and then we'll jump into questions and comments, and then we'll start taking up motions on the alternative sets. So I think, Matt, you might start, or is Dustin starting?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Actually, this is Dustin. I'll be starting us off, and Matt will be taking the second half.
Excellent. It's all you.
Great. Thank you. So that was a great intro. I don't need to introduce what we're here for today. I'll drop right into the meeting overview. So we're going to start today with the recap of the amendment alternatives. This is going to be a little bit more fast-paced than other meetings where we've really gone through detail through each, because many of you have seen it many times before. But if there are any questions or we need to go back and review something in more detail, that's totally fair game, and just please let us know. Following that, we'll review public comments, advisory panel member comments, the FMAT discussion and recommendations, followed by a review of council staff recommendations that Matt will be presenting. And then we'll have board and council member discussion and final action. So this slide displays the amendment timeline with some of the big steps taken thus far in blue, followed by the current and upcoming big steps in the amendment process, followed by green. So just a really brief recap. The amendment was initiated in December 2017, as Chris Savage said, and that was to reevaluate Bluefish management. And this was put on pause until the release of the updated MRIP information, as it had a significant impact on many of the management issues being considered. And then following the release of the 2019 operational assessment, the Bluefish stock was designated as overfished. And so the rebuilding plan was incorporated into this amendment. And under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the council is required to implement a rebuilding plan within 2 years of the overfish designation, thus giving us a good sense of urgency in getting this through final action. We are still on track with the goal of taking final action in June today to allow time for implementation by the end of 2021. So what are the management issues under consideration? So as a reminder, the amendment considers modifications to a whole array of different management issues, including the fishery management plan goals and objectives, allocation of quota between the commercial and recreational sectors, the commercial allocations to the states, the rebuilding plan, the sector quota transfer process, management uncertainty, and the de minimis provision that exists within the Commission's FMP. And since there are so many issues here with this amendment, we will provide an overview of each management issue, followed by public comments, AP input, and FMAT recommendations on that issue before moving on to the next issue. So I'll start with a brief overview of the public comments received on this action as a whole. 5 virtual public hearings were held between March 24th and April 8th, targeted towards certain states or regional groupings of states. The hearings were attended by 134 individuals in total. Written comments were accepted from March 4th through April 23rd, and 360 individuals and 18 organizations provided written comments or comments at a hearing. 277 of those individuals submitted their comments through a form letter, which was written from the recreational fishery perspective. And efforts were made to avoid double counting people and organizations who commented in multiple ways, such as commenting at multiple hearings or commenting in writing and at a hearing. Individuals and organizations were tallied separately in all public comment tables, and we did this in recognition that organizations represent many individuals. This table shows the breakdown of primary sector for the individuals and organizations who provided comments. And you can see here that 92% of the commenters were primarily affiliated with the recreational sector, as you might expect. About 80% of that total comes from the form letter, which I previously mentioned, and 5% of commenters were primarily affiliated with the commercial sector. And you can see the remaining percentages for unknown, other, or multiple primary affiliations. And I would encourage all those from the public as well as those listening that if there's more interest in gaining a more thorough understanding of detailed comments from individuals and organizations, please refer to the public comment summary document in the briefing materials tab, where all comments are included. So I'll start with the current FMP goals and objectives that's displayed here on this slide. Essentially, the goal is to conserve the bluefish resource along the Atlantic coast, with each of the objectives aiding that goal. The objectives consist of increasing scientific understanding, providing for the highest availability of bluefish, fostering cooperation across states and agencies, preventing overfishing, and reducing waste in the commercial and recreational fisheries. So this is the current FMP goals and objectives within the plan. And here we have the newly proposed FMP goals and objectives. So the first goal within the proposed FMP goals and objectives is to conserve the bluefish resource through stakeholder engagement to maintain sustainable recreational fishing and commercial harvest. So this goal is then supplemented by 5 different objectives, including Objective 1.1, achieving and maintaining a sustainable spawning stock biomass and rate of fishing mortality. Objective 1.2, promoting practices that reduce discard mortality within the recreational and commercial fishery. Objective 1.3, maintaining effective coordination between the National Marine Fisheries Service, Council and Commission, and member states by promoting compliance and to support the development and implementation of management measures. And then Objective 1.4 is to promote compliance and effective enforcement of regulations. Lastly, Objective 1.5 is promote science and monitoring and data collection that support and enhance effective ecosystem-based management of the bluefish resource. We also have a second goal within the proposed FMP goals and objectives, and this is to provide fair and equitable access to the fishery across all user groups throughout the management unit. So again, this goal is supplemented by 3 different objectives, and these are 2.1, ensure the implementation of management measures provides fair and equitable access to the resource across all groups along the coast. 2.2, consider the economic and social needs and priorities of all groups that access the bluefish resource in the development of new management measures. And lastly, Objective 2.3, maintain effective coordination with stakeholder groups to ensure optimization of economic and social benefits. So when we brought these out to the public, there were a number of comments that touched on this issue. It was a little difficult to quantify, seeing as each comment was fairly unique, but I'll talk here about some of the reoccurring comments that we received or themes. So many people talked about managing the fishery based on optimum yield rather than maximum sustainable yield. And a lot of these comments came from the perspective that the recreational fishery is a catch and release fishery. So there's economic benefit of leaving fish in the water and managing for abundance, so each angler's experience is better as they catch or able to catch more fish, but conserve by releasing the fish back into the water. There was also some comments that were a little bit more specific in regards to changing the term discard mortality to release mortality. They thought this had a little less of a negative connotation. There was also a number of people at the hearings who asked us to define or better define what fair and equitable access means. And then there was also calls to define user groups as referred to in the objectives. There was also generally comments related to making sure that there's better accountability for both sectors and ensuring that management stability is a priority. There are a number of calls to recognize that environmental stressors exist and that they should be addressed by management. And a few of these, for example, being sand mining or beach replenishment that have damaging effects to both the habitat and the abundance of forage fish that bluefish rely on. And then there was another specific comment about access to users along the coast and how this terminology doesn't consider that there are inland consumers that rely on bluefish as a source of food. So we also talked to the advisory panel, as I mentioned before, and one AP member was concerned about the public comments concerning managing only for abundance and not managing for maximum sustainable harvest. This comment came from a commercial fishery representative. There was also one individual who said that we really need to emphasize the need for ecosystem-based management. Another individual said that fair and equitable access should mean sector separation for the for-hire sector. And as you recall, this was actually something that was considered earlier on through the process, but removed and considered through the rec reform initiative. So the FMAT considered a number of suggestions from the public and the AP, but determined that the majority of comments received were already captured in the FMP goals and objectives as they were currently written. So for example, many asked to incorporate ecosystem-based management into the FMP goals and objectives, but this is already listed under Objective 1.5. In another example, there were many comments received pertaining to managing the fishery based on optimum yield in recognition of many anglers' preference to utilize the resource through catch and release. The FMAT felt that maintaining a sustainable spawning stock biomass, as described in Objective 1.1, providing fair and equitable access to all user groups described in Goal 2, and considering the economic and social needs and priorities of all groups listed in Objective 2.2 already captures the definition of managing for optimum yield. The FMAT, however, did think that the term discard mortality could be replaced by release mortality after receiving feedback from the public that discard mortality has a negative connotation and release mortality better captures the catch and release nature of the fishery. So you can see that revision here in red. Another revision in red, the FMAT agreed with a member of the public in the recommendation to change along the coast to within the management unit to allow for the inclusion of inland bluefish consumers that do not live on the coast. So we'll come back to that, but I'll move on to the commercial recreational sector allocation issue. So a brief overview here. Under the current FMP for bluefish, the acceptable biological catch, or ABC, equals the fishery level annual catch limit, also known as the ACL, which is then divided into a commercial and recreational annual catch target, or ACT, based on the allocation percentages defined in the FMP. The current allocation percentages were based on 1981 to 1989 landings data and equal an allocation of 83% to the rec sector and 17% to the commercial sector. Sector-specific expected discards are subtracted from the sector-specific ACTs to derive a commercial quota and a recreational harvest limit. And that really affects the management measures that each sector is held to. There are 5 sector allocation alternatives, including status quo. Each alternative is presented here in the top table with percentages on the left and the base years on the right. You'll notice that there are multiple bases for some of these percentages, which is indicative that those percentages represent multiple time series. So the alternatives range from the status quo alternative of 83% allocation to the recreational sector and 17% to the commercial sector, to the commercial sector, to the alternative 2A2 that has an allocation of 89% to the recreational sector and 11% to the commercial sector. The table at the bottom of the slide presents the percent change from status quo for each alternative. And given the commercial sector has a smaller allocation, the relative percent change for each alternative is much higher than those associated with the proposed recreational allocations. And so the next category alternative relates to phasing in allocation changes over the duration of the rebuilding plan. This is somewhat of a simple alternative set. The decision is whether to phase in or not. And so a phase-in approach would divide the percent shift in allocation evenly over the phase-in duration. And the 3 rebuilding plan alternatives have durations of 4, 5, and 7 years. The percent changes are presented in the bottom table. Considering the small range that the phased-in allocations would change over the 4 to 7 years, minimal impacts are expected for the recreational fishery. However, a 1.5% shift in the allocation away from the commercial sector is a much larger annual impact relative to its smaller initial allocation. So therefore, a phase-in approach may slightly reduce the economic burden on commercial stakeholders, at least in the near term. So this came out of the last meeting in terms of the complexity of the interrelatedness of these different alternatives. So We understand that some of these linkages can be a little bit confusing, so we hoped to develop this decision tree to just help visual learners as a visual representation of the relationship between the allocation alternatives. The phase-in alternatives do relate to the rebuilding plan alternatives as previously described. So starting with the top, the first decision is selecting the commercial recreational allocation alternative. And then second, you would determine whether the change in allocation should be phased in or not. And as said before, if the rebuilding plan alternative is a 4, 5, or 7-year phase-in, that would be the duration of the phase-in time period. And if no phase-in is selected, the reallocation would be implemented in full during the first year. So this table displays the breakdown of the number of commenters that supported each of the allocation alternatives, as well as the option to phase in reallocation or not. The columns display the count of comments from a form letter, individuals, and organizations. Alternative 2A3 was the most popular alternative with 287 commenters in total, and this alternative also received the greatest support from organizations. The status quo alternative received the second most support, with the majority of the support coming from the commercial sector. And the majority of those who commented on the phase-in alternatives favored no phase-in. The reoccurring rationale that we heard throughout the process was that the reallocation under the consideration was relatively small and thus did not need a phase-in period. So the advisory panel provided several comments on the topic as well, including needing to ensure that the commercial sector has sufficient allocation to allow the food producing community to continue operating. This advisor thought that in times of higher abundance, it maybe wasn't as necessary to have higher allocations, but in lower abundance, he didn't want to see the commercial sector kind of economically disadvantaged. So one AP member did not support a phase-in approach. One AP member preferred using catch data versus landings data. And then this little table here displays the comments received from other advisory panel members on their support for the various allocation alternatives. And as you can see here, 2A3 had the most with 2 advisors voicing support. So while the FMAT did not have a specific preferred alternative, they did support consideration of alternatives that utilized catch data as their basis. The reason being that the FMP already allocates the ABC, or in other words, catch, between 2 sectors. So alternatives 2A1 and 2A5 are derived from landings data. And so the FMAT recommends consideration of alternatives 2A2, 2A3, or 2A4. The FMAT also recommended not phasing in any allocation change. This recommendation is consistent with the overwhelming majority of public comments, which said that the phase-in approach does not offer much benefit when the allocations are changing by a small amount. Also, the phase-in approach would add complexity and a little bit of administrative burden. So that wraps up the commercial recreational allocations. I'll now move on to commercial allocations to the states. But before I begin discussing the commercial allocations to the states' alternative sets, I'd like to acknowledge that there was a minor error discovered within the Bluefish allocation and rebuilding draft amendment document, as well as the public hearing document. So this error was in the status quo allocation column, highlighted in green here. Some of the states' allocations were off by a few hundredths of a percent. And since many of the alternatives in the commercial allocations to the state section are linked, this error affected a few other tables and text within the section of the document. However, all revisions have been made in the documents. The boarding council has been notified, and those revisions were submitted within the briefing materials. The changes were highlighted in yellow in these documents. And in addition, the economists on FMAT reran the economic analyses for the sections, and all the conclusions from the impacts remain the same. So, okay, now to move on to the recap of this section. As I mentioned, this alternative set considers modifications to the commercial allocations to the states. As I said, the status quo allocations are here highlighted in green on the left, And these were set through Amendment 1 and are based on landings data from 1981 to 1989. The three proposed alternatives all revise the commercial allocations to the states using updated time series. Alternative 3A2 is based on landings data from 2014 to 2018, 3A3 from 2009 to 2018, and 3A4 is the hybrid approach that combines the average of historical landings from 1981 to 1989 and more recent landings 2009 to 2018. So this table displays the impacts of each alternative by showing the resulting percentage increase in blue or decrease here in red relative to the current allocations for each state. For all three alternatives, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York stand to benefit from an increased allocation. North Carolina's allocation remains relatively unchanged, and the remaining states would lose a percentage of their quota. And this is true across all three alternatives. Alternative 3A4 represents a smaller percentage change compared to alternatives 3A2 and 3A3. So the next set of alternatives within the commercial allocations to the states is the option to phase in allocation changes. A phase-in approach, as before, would divide the percent shift in allocation evenly over the phase-in duration. And like before, the phase-in period would be set equal to the duration of the preferred rebuilding alternative. So the bottom table here displays the shifts in allocation for each state across all of the allocation alternatives, considering a 4, 5, or 7-year phase-in rebuilding period. So the next alternative set under commercial allocations to the states is the trigger approach. The trigger approach has three main components. First, there are set allocations to each state below a trigger value. Second, there are allocations to each state above a trigger value. And then third, there's a trigger value that the commercial quota is compared to. So the trigger is a set value in pounds, which is informed by historical commercial quotas. So going back to the first component of the trigger approach, quota below the trigger value is allocated based on the allocation selected from alternative set 3A. Quota above the trigger value is allocated based on a tiered system whereby the allocation percentages from alternative set 3A are grouped within the following categories presented in the table above. Essentially, a state with a baseline allocation less than or equal to 1% will receive 0.1% above the trigger value. A state with a baseline allocation between 1 and 5% will receive 3% above the trigger value, and between 5 and 10%, a state will receive 7.5%. And then with a baseline allocation greater than 10%, the state will receive the remainder of the quota above the trigger, divided evenly among states. I understand that that's a little complicated to just talk through, so hopefully this slide will help demonstrate what I'm talking about. So we have the four alternatives from alternative set 3A here in white, and the baseline allocations below the trigger are in the white columns, and the allocations above the trigger are in the orange columns. We can come back to this later if it comes up through the discussion. So the last component of the trigger approach is determining the trigger value. Again, the trigger value is informed by an average of historical commercial quotas over the time series, and the commercial quota time series are predetermined by the alternative set 3A. And so the only two decisions here are whether a trigger approach should be implemented and whether the trigger value is an average of pre or post-transfer commercial quotas over the time series. So as a reminder, the transfer is referring to the historical transfers of quota that occurred from the recreational to the commercial sector. The pre-transfer average commercial quota triggers are lower than the post-transfer average commercial quota triggers. So I want to note that no formal commercial quota existed before the implementation of Amendment 1 in 2000. So that's why you see here the 10-year and the hybrid approach have the same trigger values for post and pre-transfer. So again, seeing as these various alternative sets for commercial allocations are interrelated and a little bit complex, we developed another decision tree to detail the steps in the process. So the first decision is to select the allocations to the states which have different base years. Then determine whether the allocation changes should be phased in or not. And if phasing in allocation changes is preferred, the phase-in duration will match the duration of the rebuilding plan, either 4, 5, or 7 years. If a phase-in approach is not preferred, the trigger approach may be applied. If the trigger approach is preferred, the remaining decision is to determine what the trigger threshold level will be, which may be based on pre-transfer quotas, which result in a lower trigger, or post-transfer quotas, which result in a higher trigger. So remember, the commercial allocations alternative set 3A determines both the time series used to calculate the trigger threshold value and the allocation of additional quota above the trigger value. This helps to just streamline the decision-making process. So the last alternative set under the commercial allocations to the states is the minimum default allocation alternatives. The purpose of this approach is to provide a small baseline of quota to each state so that no state is left without quota. This can be helpful for states that don't have a directed bluefish fishery, but still land a small amount of bluefish as bycatch. The minimum default alternatives apply a fixed minimum quota of either 0.1 or 0.25%, and then the remaining of the total allowable landings is allocated based on the alternatives selected from alternative set 3A. So if no action is taken on minimum default, the allocations determined by alternative set 3A remain unchanged. So here we have the breakdown of public comments received on the state commercial allocations issue. You can see that the comments were spread fairly evenly across the alternatives, with alternative 3A2 edging out, just edging out with the most support with 11 commenters. Notably, the 3A2 5-year landings alternative also received the most support from organizations. Several commenters favored this alternative because they said they thought that 5 years was plenty of time to pick up on regional trends and availability. And they thought that states that are actively harvesting bluefish in the most recent time period should be allocated sufficient quota so that transfers aren't needed as frequently. Opinions on phasing in allocation changes were also split pretty evenly, with just a few more in support or in favor of a phase-in. Not many commenters really talked about the trigger approach. All but one individual spoke in favor of not implementing a trigger. And when we did hear about it from the public, especially at the hearings, many shared feedback that the trigger approach was a bit convoluted without adding much perceived benefit. Lastly, 9 individuals and organizations supported providing states with a minimum default allocation versus 5 commenters who were opposed to the idea. Many commenters expressed support for the minimum default allocations in an effort to reduce regulatory discards in states that would otherwise have no allocation. The 0.1% minimum default allocation alternative received slightly more support than the 0.25 minimum default allocation. So as before, the AP met and discussed this issue as well and provided some feedback. 2 advisors supported the status quo commercial allocations to the states, alternative 3A1. 1 advisor supported 3A2 and said that the most recent data should be used since allocations will be reviewed every 10 years under the Council's new policy. 2 advisors supported 0.25% minimum default allocations. 1 supported no phase-in. 1 supported not using a trigger. And a few advisory panel members thought it really important that we maintain state-to-state transfers and that tool continue to be utilized by administrative commissioners. So the FMAT determined that selecting an allocation alternative is a policy decision that should be made solely by the Council and Board with consideration of the public hearing documents, impact analyses, and public input provided thus far. So in regard to the option of phase-in, the FMAT pointed out several pros and cons. States losing quota resulting from reallocation would stand to economically benefit from a phase-in. The cons include the potential to prolong inefficiencies in allocation, the administrative burden of processing transfers, and adding complexity to the specifications process, a process which will likely be very complex with the addition of the rebuilding plan and all these changing management issues, or potentially changing management issues. The FMAT, however, did provide a consensus recommendation to provide each state with a minimum default allocation of 0.1%. The rationale was that it would reduce regulatory discards, but at the same time isn't overly burdensome to other states' allocations. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Matt, who will cover the rebuilding plan, the sector transfers, management uncertainty, and de minimis.
Thanks, Dustin. Just want to confirm that everyone can hear me all right.
I can hear you
I'm
just
good.
fine.
Yeah, we can
Thanks,
hear you, Matt. Go ahead.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you. So now before we dive into the rebuilding plan section, I'll just give a brief recap on stock status. So this figure's from the 2019 Bluefish operational assessment and displays sector-specific landings and recreational discards in the gray bars. The dashed line represents the overfishing threshold, while the solid black line represents the fishing mortality rate. So when that solid black line is above the dotted black line, that means that overfishing was occurring. So as a result of the last operational assessment, overfishing was occurring throughout the time series with the exception of 2018. So ultimately overfishing not occurring. Also from that 2019 assessment, this figure displays recruitment in the gray bars and the spawning stock biomass trend in the black line. And as you can see, the solid black line is crossed below the overfish threshold, and the Magnuson-Stevens Act dictates that the stock must now go through a rebuilding plan to rebuild the stock back to the biomass target, which is that upper dashed line. So the following alternatives were developed to rebuild the bluefish stock, and since the council is legally required to implement a rebuilding plan following the overfish designation, the status quo alternative is only presented here for consistency. So we have alternative 4B, which is the 4-year constant harvest scenario. 4C is the 5-year plan that would utilize the council's updated risk policy. And 4D is the 7-year constant fishing mortality rate rebuilding plan. So the two figures on this slide depict projected catch and spawning stock biomass for each rebuilding plan. And it's important to remember that these catch levels and reference points are subject to change. And regardless of which alternative is selected, the assessment scientists will perform assessment updates and rerun projections every 2 years, as each projection is based on the current stock status information. But so as you can see in the figure to the left, the rebuilding plans project different levels of allowable catch over the durations of the plans. The constant harvest scenario, which is the blue dashed line, holds catch lower over the course of 4 years compared to the catches of the other plans. But as you can see on the figure to the right, the stock is expected to rebuild faster under the 4-year plan. And alternatively, the 7-year constant fishing mortality rebuilding plan is projected to have higher catches initially, but will obviously take longer to rebuild. So the constant fishing mortality 7-year rebuilding plan received the most support with a total of 293 commenters, and that included 11 different organizations. The 5-year plan, which utilizes the council risk policy, was the second most popular with 14 total commenters in support. 12 commenters favored the 4-year constant harvest approach, and then in addition, 4 individuals at the hearing shared a preference for adopting a 10-year rebuilding plan. And that was something that was removed from the alternative set earlier on throughout the amendment process. But so many who favored the 7-year and 10-year plan spoke about the uncertainty and whether fishing mortality or environmental factors have the greatest influence on the stock. So just to give some general comments on that, 10 commenters doubted that fishing mortality was even an issue and said that the stock is cyclically driven or has moved offshore. 7 other commenters expressed concern that the bluefish stock is hurt by low abundance in forage fish and thought that this was the primary issue. 20 people provided comments about bluefish's low abundance, on-the-water observations of not encountering bluefish like they used to, and a call to the council and board to take immediate action. So the advisors then provided feedback on these issues. 3 advisors supported alternative 4D, which is the 7-year plan. It offers the highest catch and the longest time period to successfully rebuild. 1 advisor supported 4C, the P-Star 5-year plan. They want to focus on a role of forage fish when considering these rebuilding plans. And then 2 advisors shared concerns about unreliable MRIP estimates and the effect they may have on rebuilding. So the FMAT agreed the rebuilding plan should be as short as possible while considering the needs of the fishing communities that depend on the resource and accounting for the uncertainty that's inherent in the cyclical environmental driven nature of the stock. And while not all FMAT members provided recommendations on this issue, the majority thought that alternatives 4C and 4D may be preferable because these plans project catch that increase steadily over the duration of the rebuilding period. And this would provide greater stability and would prevent a major 1-year increase in the ABC once the rebuilding plan is complete, which you would see in the constant harvest approach. And the stock assessment scientists on the FMAT did express some concerns that should be considered by the council and board members. Namely, some components of the stock may not be accessible to the inshore fishery if the anecdotal evidence of offshore migrations are true. There's also no offshore surveys to verify these trends. And there are also limited tagging studies assessing the regional bluefish abundance and migration. So as a result, the data may not be available to inform the model, which may have an impact on the projections and the ability to monitor rebuilding progress. So now transitioning to the sector transfers. For the quota transfers, the first alternative set is the sector transfer process. Alternative 5A1 would maintain the current process for sector transfers, whereby quota can only be transferred from the recreational to the commercial sector through the specifications process. Alternative 5A2 would allow for optional bidirectional transfers through the annual specifications process with predefined guidelines. And the transfer would consist of a portion of the total ABC in the form of a landings limit transfer, and transfers would not occur if the stock is overfished or overfishing is occurring. But if we are not overfished anymore, but still in a rebuilding plan, those transfers can still occur. And then alternative set 5B covers the transfer cap. So 5B1 maintains the existing recreational to commercial sector transfer cap of 10.5 million pounds as the commercial quota. And a key thing to note here is that bidirectional transfers are implemented along with the status quo transfer cap alternative. The transfer cap would only apply to transfers from the recreational to the commercial sector. And this alternative would take no action on implementing a cap on transfers in the opposite direction. And then finally, alternative 5B2 would revise the cap on transfers in either direction equal to 10% of the ABC. So this table now displays the breakdown of public comments received on these sector transfers. A total of 288 commenters said they supported bidirectional transfers, and that included 6 organizations. And this is compared to the 15 commenters that supported the status quo process. And it's also worth noting here that 17 individuals and 6 organizations said that quotas should not be transferred between the sectors at all. And this was not an amendment alternative, but since it came up so many times, we wanted to make sure that the council and board were aware of these comments. And then in total, 288 commenters supported updating the transfer cap to 10% of the ABC, while only 12 were against that idea. When the advisors were asked about this issue, 1 advisor supported 5A1 until recreational catch accounting can be done more accurately. And 3 advisors supported 5A2. The transfer provisions are necessary to ensure both sectors support one another to avoid any overages. And the FMAT offered no specific recommendation on the sector transfer process because they reasoned it's more of a policy decision to be made by the council and board. But the FMAT did recommend the transfer cap be updated to 10% of the ABC. And this is since the transfer cap would scale with biomass, the FMAT felt that this would become relevant as the stock rebuilds to the target biomass level. The next section, wrapping up here quickly, covers management uncertainty. Management uncertainty is a tool that allows the board and council the ability to reduce the ABC by a predetermined amount to account for management uncertainty in any aspect of the fishery. So it essentially creates a buffer to account for the fact that a management approach or data has uncertainty inherent within it. So under the status quo alternative, implementing a management uncertainty buffer would reduce the quotas for both sectors when reducing effort to lower the risk of overfishing. Alternative 6B would then refine this tool to enable management uncertainty to target one specific sector while avoiding negatively affecting the other sector. So as you can see now in this Bluefish flowchart from Amendment 1, this is the current measures. Management uncertainty is accounted for prior to the sector split, so any reduction would trickle down into reductions for both the commercial and recreational sectors. So the new proposed flowchart would add sector-specific ACLs, which together would equal the ABC. Catch would be allocated to the two sectors depending on the allocation selected in the amendment. Then each sector's ACT would equal the sector-specific ACLs minus any deductions for management uncertainty. So in this way, a management uncertainty buffer could be applied to one sector without negatively impacting the other sector. So feedback on this issue from the public was mixed. For 6A, the status quo alternative, there were 277 comments, 6 individuals and 8 organizations that supported this no action approach. In the form letter, it was stated that the recreational sector has no ability to address the uncertainty association with recreational catch, and as such, management uncertainty should not be specific to each sector. But on the other side, there were 19 individuals and 5 organizations that voiced support for the post-sector split alternative, and many of these commenters preferred the target approach in which management uncertainty could be applied. From the advisors, 2 indicated support for the sector-specific split, and then 1 advisor thought management uncertainty should not only be applied as a reduction to the ACT, but potentially offer situations where the ACT can be increased. The FMAT did reach consensus on this issue and recommends a sector-specific management uncertainty for several reasons. First, it allows the monitoring committee to be more precise when applying the management uncertainty buffer. Second, the application of management uncertainty is fairer and more equitable under this approach. And then third, it has received strong support from many different user groups, technical staff, and fishery managers throughout its development. So now for our last issue, this alternative set covers the de minimis provision, which is a board-only provision. De minimis status essentially allows a state that doesn't harvest very much bluefish to be exempt from certain management requirements. Under the Commission's current bluefish plan, states which land less than 0.1% of the coastwide commercial landings in the year prior are exempt from fishery independent monitoring requirements for the following year. And this is the status quo alternative, 7A. The 4 new de minimis alternatives all propose to expand on this by adding some flexibility in setting recreational measures. So all 5 of the de minimis alternatives would retain the exemption from fishery independent monitoring. And then alternatives 7B through E all update the threshold for qualifying for de minimis status. So a state's 3-year average of combined recreational and commercial landings would be compared against 1% of coastwide landings for the same 3-year period. And if a state's landings are less than 1% of the coastwide landings, then de minimis status would be granted. So if we're moving down from 7B to 7E, the alternatives can sort of be described providing de minimis states the option to keep in place less restrictive rec measures to more restrictive rec measures. So 7B exempts de minimis states from setting any rec measures. 7C would require de minimis states set rec measures, but they would have the flexibility to set those measures of their choice with the goal of deterring shifts in effort from other states to theirs. 7D would allow a de minimis state to maintain the measures that were in place when they first qualified for de minimis. And 7E would allow de minimis states to set measures equal to a 3-fish bag limit for private anglers and a 5-fish bag limit for party charter vessels, and these are the measures that are currently in place. So again, looking at the breakdown of public comments, 14 commenters supported the status quo de minimis alternative compared to 13 who favored updating the provisions to allow some more flexibility. However, there was quite a bit of spread across 7B through 7E. Focusing on the advisory panel comments, the AP didn't provide much input on this issue, but one member did support 7B and said that the de minimis states catch so few fish that the regulation should remain as unrestrictive as possible. And another advisor favored 7C because it allows states to think about their own management measures and what fits their unique situation best. Excuse me. And from the FMAT perspective, they did not offer any recommendations. However, one FMAT member said that the board will have to weigh the economic and social benefits of increased access to recreational fishers in de minimis states against the potential risk of shifts in effort from neighboring states. So trying to wrap up here with some public comments and then the staff memo. Here we're just displaying reoccurring general comments. We did receive a variety of different topics that were, very important to the public, and we wanted to be sure that we covered those. So these comments either pertain to multiple management issues or are not directly related to the issues that are being considered in the amendment. 22 individuals and organizations said that management should account for catch and release aspect of the fishery and recognize the value of fish left in the water. And this context in which this was said varied by each commenter, but many said this in reference to managing for higher abundance to recognize the economic value of the sport fishing industry. Many also shared the sentiment in support of halting sector transfers. 10 commenters said that recreational reporting and accountability needs to be improved, and similarly, 4 individuals thought that the recreational discarding issue should be addressed by management. 9 commenters expressed strong support with using the MRIP data for management and thought that the data was not believable. 6 individuals said the bag limit should be lowered, while 3 said it should be increased. 6 people supported cutting the commercial quota, and then 4 supported advocating to increase the commercial quota. So now, we covered quite a bit of material here. I just want to briefly recap the FMAT and council recommendations as a summary before discussion. And we can come back to these next few slides at any point. Council staff fully support the FMAT recommendations on the FMP goals and objectives, which include implementing minor revisions to the language that were suggested during the public comment process. For the sector allocations, council staff recommends alternative 2A3, which is 87% rec, 13% commercial. And this is given a variety of reasons. First being that the vast majority of public comments supported this alternative. It offers the second highest economic benefit to the commercial sector. It's based on catch data. And then the time series encompasses the most recent 20 years of fishery performance. And this considers more of the cyclical nature present in the fishery over time as compared to a shorter time series, which was captured in many of the public comments. For the phase-in alternative, the FMAT and council staff recommended alternative 2B1, no phase-in, and this recommendation is consistent with the overwhelming majority of public comments and doesn't offer as much benefit when the allocations are changing by such a small amount. So for the commercial allocations to the states, just kind of going through each one here, the status quo alternative 3A1 represents fishery abundance and allocations from 1981 to 1989, which no longer really reflects the current nature of the bluefish fishery. And over time, the bluefish fishery is available in certain regions due to the migratory habits and preferences for offshore waters. And additionally, this change in availability is more well represented over a longer time series. So kind of by a process of elimination here, council staff did not recommend alternative 3A2. And then moving along, by design, alternative 3A4 captures a wide range of years, including the historical aspects of the overall time series. But since this time series incorporates the historical abundance, the allocations don't fully represent the current needs of all states, and then this may warrant state-to-state transfers immediately following reallocation. And then finally, focusing on public comments, they were split. However, most support was provided for 3A2, followed by 3A3, the 5 and 10 year, and then 3A1, status quo, and then lastly, 3A4. So for all of these reasons, kind of process of elimination, council staff ended up recommending alternative 3A3. For the phase-in, council staff and FMAT noted that it was a fairly unpopular alternative set, despite receiving a little bit of support at the public hearings. Again, phase-in allocations has the added levels of complexity, administrative burden, and it's also tied to these alternatives that don't have much of a change over time. So council staff recommended 3B1, no phase-in. For the trigger, after reviewing all the public comments, the FMAT and council staff recommended 3C1, no trigger. The public found this alternative set to be very complex and there were limited perceived benefits. For the minimum default allocations, council staff and the FMAT recommended a 0.1% minimum default allocation because it would allow states that would otherwise lose their allocation throughout this process to retain a minimum default to allow for incidental catch. And it doesn't really affect other states that much moving forward through the economic analyses. For the rebuilding plan, council staff recommended alternative 4C, which uses the updated 2019 council risk policy. And by design, this policy evaluates the current stock biomass in relation to its target and threshold and adjusts risk accordingly. And then as with the FMAT, council staff also notes that the almost even split in support for bidirectional transfers, which is 5A2, except for accounting for the form letter, the vast majority of comments supported bidirectionality. And many of the public comments describe that this is more fair and equitable since transfers can go in both directions. For alternative set 5B, the FMAT and council staff recommended 5B2, a transfer cap of up to 10%. This is, scales well with biomass and seems to be a good approach from a biological and process-oriented perspective. And then finally, for management uncertainty, again, from a process perspective, 6B, which is the recommendation from the FMAT and council staff, allows the monitoring committee to be as precise as possible with applying a buffer to one sector without negatively affecting the other. And with that, that concludes our presentation. I know we threw a lot of information at you, and we are happy to go back to any slides at any points. Thank you for listening. So, Mr. Chairman, back to you.
Thank you very much, Matt and Dustin. This is a very complex amendment, and you guys, I just want to give you a shout out and kudos for all the work that you put into this. You both have a very good grasp on the complexities of how this all works together, and I certainly appreciate the work that you've done with the FMAT and the recommendations from council staff as well as a basis for the discussion as it unfolds. So I'm sure that we're going to have some questions. What I'd like to do, it's 11:15. Let's see if folks have questions. I certainly have a couple myself, and maybe I'll start. So Matt, when you were talking about the rebuilding plan, the 4D, which is the constant fishing mortality for 7 years, it says it requires an adjustment to the council risk policy. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for me, so I can understand where the adjustment would be needed and why?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So that's just because it would allow for catch that's higher than what's being proposed in the P-STAR council risk policy plan. And that's more of a behind the scenes adjustment that I would be doing in the environmental assessment, just noting that the council is approving these potential catch limits that may be higher than what's approved through the risk policy. So it's nothing that would need to be, action would need to be taken on. It's just something that I would work with GARFO staff on as we develop the final environmental assessment.
Okay, but we wouldn't need to do a framework to make an adjustment to the risk policy. Is that what you're saying? Correct.
There would be no framework necessary.
Okay, so there'd be no additional action. You would do it behind the scenes. Okay, that helps me understand that a little bit more. I have a couple other questions, but let me go to the council and board members at this point. I'm sure that folks have questions. Does anyone have any questions for Matt or Dustin at this time? Okay, I have Dewey Hemmelwright and then Emerson Hasbrook. Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And can you go to the slide? I'm not sure I don't think there's slide number, but it's a slide that has the FMAT's concerns about uncertainty.
Uncertainty for which, is it management uncertainty?
Yes, I think so. Maybe in the future it would help if you put numbers on your slides if possible.
That's a great recommendation. Apologies, Dewey. Is this the slide you're looking for?
No, it's It's not.
Is it related to allocations or which uncertainty with which issue?
I think it was allocation, maybe. Maybe I should be more precise.
Dewey, were you referring to the stock assessment scientist concerns?
I think so, yes. Yeah, I apologize for that.
Okay, that would be on slide 39, Matt.
Thanks, Dustin.
Yes, this is it. And my question would be, do we know when or if any possibilities that these concerns could be addressed, will be addressed, or what's the status besides just concerns? Because I think that, from my personal opinion, I think this has a lot to do with this cylindrical nature of the fishery and of the migratory patterns of bluefish. And I'm just curious, any more insight on this? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, is it okay to just jump in?
Yeah, please do. That way I don't have to call on you. Just jump in when you have a question.
Sounds good. Thank you. So yeah, thanks for your question, Dewey. It's a great question and something that Dustin and I have been talking about for a while with the stock assessment scientist. The information that I can offer in regards to your question is that we have a management track assessment in 2021, and this is just going to rerun the model with data through 2019. And this has the potential to alter the biological reference points and biomass in relation to those points, and that'll occur every 2 years. And then we have a research track assessment in 2022, and that's going to change the model if necessary and incorporate more data, the whole process, and then that'll be available to management in a few years. So we kind of need to wait and see what's going to come out of these assessments, as it will change, aspects of the rebuilding plan and all of those things moving forward. But we are, trying to pay as close attention as possible to the comments we're receiving about, the environmental aspects, the migration, availability. And, I'm encouraged that we have these assessments coming up in the very near future.
I'll just add one more thing there. This is Dustin. There is, some limitations in terms of funding for, offshore surveys and tagging studies. So maybe Tony would be best suited to answer any follow-ups you have, but this was just put forward because it was a discussion that was had at the AFMET level, and there are concerns about data limitations for the resources that are being utilized to assess this stock as it currently stands.
Yeah, my follow-up comment was because I think these concerns are very viable, and I think are, as part of the data. You can do a stock assessment or update every so often, but if you don't have no data to put in there or to address these concerns, it's going to be lacking. And that's something I feel like that's very important, especially these concerns that are pointed out here. I think has a big effect on this bluefish stock. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dewey, for that. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Matt and Dustin, for your presentations. There was a slide that was displayed, and I'm sorry, I don't recall if it was Dustin or Matt, that showed the percent reduction in commercial allocation with the various options, 2A1, 2A2, 2A3, et cetera. Yes, that slide. Thank you. So in the presentation, Matt, you said that council staff recommends 2A3 since it offers the second highest economic benefit to the commercial sector. Don't you think that's a little misleading, seeing how 2A2 represents, I'm sorry, 2A3 represents a 24% reduction in the commercial allocation, whereas 2A1 has a 0% change, 2A5 has a negative 6% change, and 2A4 a negative 18. So that 2A3 really is not the second highest economic benefit to the commercial industry. It's only that way if you eliminate, and I know there was some discussion in the FMAP memo, if you eliminate some of the other options. And I think the ones that were eliminated were 2A1 and 2A5. So I don't see where 2A3 is the second highest economic benefit to the commercial fishing industry. And it represents a 24% reduction. So and I think that's somewhat misleading.
Yeah, Emerson, thank you for your question and your comment there. And apologies for being misleading. You did hit the nail on the head there, though, when you removed those other alternatives. The recommendation is for using catch data. So when you remove the alternatives that use landings data, 2A3 offered the second highest benefit to the commercial sector. But I really do see how that can be misleading, and I apologize for that. But thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention, and yeah, no, it was a great point. So thank you.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead, Emerson.
Yeah. So, but those other alternatives are still on the table. We can consider all 5 of those options under 2A. We don't have to disallow 2A1 and 2A5. And then also, you had said that the highest amount of public comment was, I believe, for 2A3 as well. But the FMAP points out that when you exclude the form letter, status quo received the most support in public comment. So that's all that I have for now, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thanks, Emerson. I appreciate that. Tom Fody, you're next.
Sorry it took me so long to get off. I just looking at these tables and the management uncertainty. I mean, we've been having management uncertainty with Bluefish for the 35 years that I've been sitting around doing Bluefish. And one of the reasons I got involved with the commission back in the 80s was because of Bluefish, because we were basically doing plans that weren't based on real data, it was just based on people's feelings, without putting bag limits in. I don't see anything that will get us better data in the next 10 years because of the money not being there to do better surveys, offshore surveys. I mean, with the introduction of wind, it's even going to cause more problems with surveys. I mean, the question I ask is, how do we know what we're going to rebuild in a 7-year period? The other thing we haven't put in this document, which I would have loved to have seen, because I kind of demanded it years ago when we started talking about going to a 3-fish bag limit. I asked what we were in comparison to the 50-year average on Bluefish back then. So now where we are in comparison to the 80-year average on Bluefish. Are we in the middle? Because back then, the stocks had gone way down after the boom of the 60s and 70s. But when we looked at the overall 50-year average, we were actually above the 50-year average. And we're putting in regulations of, I don't know. I'm not sure where we're putting regulations in it now. I'm not sure what the percentages are on what the average catch has been over a period of time. And we have that data for 50 or 60 years. So I'd like to see that data one of these days. But I also don't see how you can basically say we will build this in 5, 7, or 10 years. Well, we really have no idea. I mean, I look at catches in Raritan Bay because that was one of the things people say there's no fish in Raritan Bay. Now, I've been out 3 times in Raritan Bay in the last 2 weeks, and all of a sudden we're catching bluefish from 1 to 12 pounds, which we hadn't seen in 3 years. Now, that's not because the stock changed. That's just because they showed up in Raritan Bay. So that's a real problem when we start talking about management uncertainty. How do we deal with that?
Matt or Dustin, do you guys have anything you want to add to Tom's kind of comment question?
If Tom has a interest in looking at like a longer time period of biomass levels, that's something I think that comment could be submitted to Tony Wood. We don't have that data readily available, so unfortunately I'm not able to pull that up on the fly.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. And thanks for your question, Tom, and your comment.
To follow up on that, could we get that data? Because I want to see where we are with the average over the long period of time, like 50 years, the same way we do with striped bass.
I think I'm going to defer to Tony Wood if he wants to take that one. I see his hand raised.
Yeah, I see Tony's hand just came up. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, that's something that I can put together. At the last benchmark, we shifted the time series that went into the assessment from 85 to present. The rec data makes up 90% of the catch data that goes into the assessment, and we only have that data back to 81 or 82, but we do have commercial data back to the 50s, so it's something that I could definitely put together.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Tony. I appreciate that. We'll just work with staff, and we'll get Tom will get something put together and send it out to the board and the council. But yeah, whenever you have time to do that, Tony, that'd be appreciated. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
All right. Dan Farnham, got your hand up. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yep. I have a question for either presenter here. Is there any way we could bring up table 23 in the public hearing document?
I'm pulling it up. Just 1 second, please. And there's a slight delay sometimes.
Yep. No problem, Matt. Yep. Thank you.
And that was table 23.
If I could, yeah, it's the recreational to commercial sector transfer amounts.
Matt, that's page 54 on the public hearing doc. Perfect.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Yep, that's it. So now I'm looking at this, right, and every year since 2000, excluding 2000, there's been a transfer of quota from the recreational sector to the commercial sector. So I can assume by looking at this that the recreational sector didn't exceed its RHL in any of those years outside of 2000. Is that a good assumption?
That is a good assumption. I think there may be 1 year, and I'm pulling from my memory here. I would definitely want to confirm it. I think 2007, the recreational fishery did exceed the RHL after a transfer was made, but since the overage was due to a transfer, there were no accountability measures implemented because the commercial sector also did not go over.
Right, okay. But how about now, since the recalibration of MRIP, which is what the reallocation is essentially based upon, how many of these years would the recreational sector have exceeded its RHL if you took into the recalibration, of MRIP, took that into account?
I can take this one. This is Dustin. So I really would feel uncomfortable using updated MRIP information in landings and comparing them to an RHL that was based on uncalibrated MRIP estimates. It's really an apples to oranges comparison. So I think it wouldn't really be fair to make assessments in that manner. But you got to also remember that the stock assessments were based on uncalibrated MRIP information. So if the calibrated estimates were used, you would have likely seen higher RHLs. I'm sorry that maybe doesn't really answer what you're looking for, but that's what I'm providing.
No, it does. It makes it's a little clearer, definitely. But I guess what my point was going to be was that these transfers wouldn't have occurred or will not occur in the future after recalibrating MRIP. Is that a good conclusion?
I'm not in the business in predicting the future. I think the recreational landings values are like the calibrations are likely to be higher compared to uncalibrated estimates, but we're talking about a lot of changes here today, whether the stock will rebuild to a much higher level. We're talking about potential changes in allocations between the two sectors. So Yeah, I see what you're getting at, and I see, you can look at trends, but I definitely wouldn't feel comfortable making projections about the future.
Yep. Okay. Very good. Thanks for that. I appreciate. Yep.
All right, thanks, Dan, for your question. Dustin, for your answer on that. Did you have a follow-up, Dan? I still see your hand up.
No, I'm all good. I'll put my hand down.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Is there anyone else from the council or the board that has any questions for staff on their presentation? Emerson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since nobody else raised their hand, I figured I'd get a shot at a second question. So there was a slide that showed the overfishing status. If we could bring that up.
This what you're looking for, Emerson?
Yes, I think so. No, the one that showed overfishing. Yes, that one. Thank you. So, except for the terminal year, overfishing was occurring throughout the time series, and we didn't realize that, right? So, is this due to the recalibration of the MRIP data? Is that what caused this situation?
Yeah, that definitely has the most weight carried into the overfishing status, over the course of the time series.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emerson.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I've given a little bit more thought to the last question that was posed to me. And I think since I gave a very minimal answer, I think at least in the short term, I think a good point was made that there's unlikely to be transfers occurring, considering how both sectors are, bumping up against their limits. So I can't project, much farther than the next couple of years, but it seems to be, in terms of the way the trends are going, it's unlikely that transfers will be occurring in the short term.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought too. Appreciate that comment. Before I go out to the public, is there anybody else from the board or the council that has any questions they want to raise to staff on their presentation? Michelle Duvall, go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't know, this might be more of a question for Tony Wood, but just in the rebuilding projections for the different 5-year and 7-year approaches. So, just looking at the graphs that Matt had up earlier about that showed, there's been some decline in recruitment through that time series. And, so when those projections are done for the 5-year and 7-year approach, is that based on more the long-term average recruitment, or did those sort of take into account, the reduced recruitment that had been seen over the previous 10 years? Thanks.
All the projections are based on the entire time series of empirical recruitment, the distribution of that time series.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Tony. Anyone else from the board or the council before I go to the public? Okay, seeing no hands at this time, let me step out into the public arena here for questions. This is more for questions regarding the presentation. I'm going to start with James Fletcher, and then Mike, I'll come to you next. Go ahead, Jim.
In this last 50 years that we have commercial data, have you looked at the cyclical pattern of the tide cycles, of the solar cycles, of the North Atlantic oscillation, to see whether the abundance of bluefish corresponds to something that is natural? Being at my age, past 75, I have seen these fish cycle, and I believe that there are cyclical patterns that the scientists are not looking at. So is it possible that the scientists could go back and compare the cyclical patterns with the data? We need a different aspect in this rather than a short-term period. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, James. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to offer to that.
This is Matt. Yeah, thanks, James, for your question. It's a a great suggestion, and your comment right here hits with what a lot of the other public comments have been saying about the cyclical nature of things being environmentally driven. So thinking about those oscillations, the tides, is right in line with those different perspectives. And I think as we go through these next assessments, those are things that can be brought to the table for discussion. Right now, we're working on we're working with the best information we have. So as we get into the next assessments, that's something that definitely can be considered.
All right, thanks, Matt, for that. Next from the public, I have Mike Wayne. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. Matt, I had a question about the management uncertainty issue. I heard you talk about the justification for option 6A, the no action status quo alternative. But I didn't hear, or perhaps I missed, the justification for the post-sector split for management uncertainty. So that's my first question. And then my second question is, one thing that I've been struggling with is what can the rec sector do to address management uncertainty if the council and the board select a post-sector split for this issue? So that's my second question.
Thanks for those questions, Mike. Very great questions, and I'm happy to clarify. So 6B, some of the justification for the FMAT and the staff recommendation is that it allows both sectors, obviously to have their own uncertainty be applied. So, issues that we've had in the past at the monitoring committee level are how to, account for uncertainties with discards. We've had MRIP estimated discards. We've had discards from the Science Center. And at times we want to, think about potentially making an adjustment because we're uncertain of what these discard estimates may actually be. But no management uncertainty buffer has been implemented because if we wanted to say have a buffer on the commercial side, which discards are negligible, but we're not sure about that moving forward, any adjustment there would also reduce the recreational harvest limit for the recreational sector. So having this post-sector split allows for that process to be done for each sector. It allows the monitoring committee to review both things separately and apply any uncertainty buffer that's necessary to each sector specifically. So that that was the justification for why we went with 6B. And then can you remind me your second question again, please?
Yeah, sir. So the second question is, and I'll just broaden it out based on your response there. What can the fishery do to help address management uncertainty, whether you're from the recreational or commercial sector? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's another great one. So, I would start by saying getting involved in the management process as much as possible, submitting public comments, your, on the water observations, those sorts of things. Members of the public could work with their states to encourage them to implement, a recreational release volunteer angler survey, just working to improve understandings of discard estimates. But, it's widespread. Management uncertainty can cover any sort of management issue. And for Bluefish, I don't believe any buffer has been taken for management uncertainty in recent years. So this is just, a tool that we would want to have in the toolbox to be sector specific for, both aspects of the fishery. So I hope that answers your question.
Mike, did you have a follow-up on that, or do you want me to move on?
I'm good. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Dave Sikorsky, I saw your hand. Did you have a question? I saw it went back down, but if you had a question, go ahead.
Sorry, Mike, I'll pass.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dave. Okay. Let me, and I'm sorry, I was in the public. Dave's with the commission. So let me stick with the public at this point. Is there anybody else from the audience, from the public, that has any questions for staff? All right, seeing no hands raised, let me bring it back to the council and the board. Before we begin the process of working through this amendment, let me ask one last time, does anyone have any questions for the purposes of understanding the document and what was presented here today before we start moving through the different sections and different alternatives to make decisions to finalize this amendment? Dewey Hemmelwright, go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, thank you. Listening to the comments and questions asked, I kind of wonder if there's anything that the rec community or the commercial community can do to address the uncertainties. It sounds like it's all has to do with funding or a direction taken by management. And I don't see much influence that the rec or commercial industry can have on that. I'm really struggling with listening to the conversation. It's almost like this is a paper exercise of uncertainties, and there's nothing that the harvesters or folks fishing can really do to influence this as we go down this road. And I'm not sure, not sure the direction that we're going to be able to influence something to get something fixed on these uncertainty. That is a really overriding, arching part of this amendment here.
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Dewey. I will say that, I think that there's the accountability, well, the uncertainty on the commercial sector is a little more certain based on the quota and the management of that quota by the states and by GARFO. It is more difficult on the recreational sector for that uncertainty in their harvest. But I think, there's a lot of discussions right now happening about trying to find ways to provide additional sets of data on the recreational sector so that we can be a little more certain as to what their landings and catch are. I think it's going to take some time, but I do appreciate your thoughts and comments. I see your hand went back up. Did you want to have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, it's not. I'm more focused on the status of the stock and the unknowns about that. I understand the part of uncertainty with both sectors catch accounting, but it's the fact of the matter is I mean, our status of the stock based on the data provided and it goes into the stock assessment. I still got more questions with that. So it's not about that part of how each sector is going to account for its catch per se, because I believe the overriding issue is there's other things happening with the static and migratory patterns of the stock that we might not be seeing, or it might not be a true picture of the abundance
I see. Okay.
given there. So that's what I'm focused on. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I got you. All right. Thanks for that, Dewey. Appreciate that. Roy Miller, I have you next. Go ahead, Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if staff could go back to the graphic that shows this spawning stock biomass over time.
Yep, I'll pull it right up. 1 second, please.
All right, I'd like to just acknowledge the elephant in the room with regard to the spawning stock biomass. Is our goal, frankly, to restore the spawning stock biomass to that upper dotted line, which we apparently have never achieved within the time series shown before us? And if we were to restore the spawning stock biomass to the target level, wouldn't there be cascading effects on the ecosystem from putting that number of predators in our inshore waters? I'm thinking about species that we're also attempting to manage, like weakfish, striped bass, that these bluefish would be potential competitors with. And so, it's kind of a generic question. There might not be an easy, simple answer, but it really worries me when we're trying to attain a biomass level of this predator that it's kind of unprecedented within the period of time that we're talking about. Thank you. And if no one can answer that, I understand.
Yeah, you make a good point, Roy. You sound like me a little bit with the discussions that we've had over the years with striped bass. It's yeah, I appreciate your comment. It's I wonder if it's achievable, and I guess we'll find out as we make changes today and start moving the line. Start with the attempt, I guess, to take spawning stock biomass above the threshold and into that range between the threshold and the target to see what we can achieve. But it's a great point, and I appreciate your comment. I don't know if does anybody on staff have anything they want to add to that for Roy?
This is Matt. I would just add that it's a great comment. It's we have high hopes for the rebuilding plan and looking forward to the assessments, but it's a very good point to bring forward, and something we'll watch as we continue on.
Yeah. And I'll just add to my own personal interest in the rebuilding plan. Maybe it's, given where we are and what we're trying to achieve, maybe a little longer term strategy on the rebuilding plan is warranted, so that the impacts to both recreational commercial fisheries as well as to the ecosystem perhaps kind of it can be extended, maybe to the 7-year approach rather than the 5 or the earlier, shorter term approaches. So just thoughts that I have in my head as we're moving forward with this. So I've got a couple more hands that came up. Let's go to Tom Foti, and then Jim Gilmore, you'll be after Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, as Roy Miller was talking about, I was thinking about the economic impact of the rules and regulations. I know when we put in the 10 fish bag limit in, New Jersey party and charter boats lost a lot of customers from Pennsylvania, and the inner cities used to come down, basically catch bluefish, bring them back, pickle them, or have a fish fry and things like that. Went to 15, we lost a lot of those customers, but there was still a number there. When we went to 3 and 5, we've lost almost all those customers that would take a bus and come down and go fishing for bluefish on the party and charter boats. It's just a huge economic impact. And I didn't see any of that economic impact on what these regulations would do in the plan. Are we going to be doing any of that?
Thanks for your question, Tom. A lot of those economic impacts should be captured within the public hearing document. I have some slides that I can pull up as well, and we do have the FMAT economist on the line if we need to defer any questions that way.
Yeah, my concern with the public hearing, I looked at the number of people that attended the public hearings in 5 public hearings, and that's 124 people. I used to remember when we have a bluefish hearings, we used to have 2 of them in New Jersey, and we'd have about 150 between the 2 of them. We have lost the participation from the public. Part of it's the pandemic, part of it's Zoom, but we're just not getting people in public hearings like we did 5 or 6 years ago. So what we get is if we look at the fishing public and we look at the percentage of people that turned out to the public hearings, it's like 0.0001%, because we're talking about, alone in New Jersey, 890,000 anglers, and we get probably 15 or 20 that wasn't staff on the hearing call, it just doesn't reflect what the public is really feeling, because we have no opinions what they're thinking about. That's our fault, because we have done a poor job of basically reaching out to that sector.
All right, thanks for your comments, Tom. Appreciate that. Jim Gilmore, I have you next. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And just a follow-up to Roy Miller's comment. So just in support of it, it's a great comment. And I actually did my master's thesis on bluefish abundance distribution and whatever back in the using data up into 85. And one of the things that came out of that, or at least there was an indication, was not only is there, you know, the issue about would we ever hit that spawning stock biomass and its amount of predators, it was also a relationship between striped bass abundance and bluefish, and some inverse relationship that was indicated. So, and at the time there was research needed on that, which was never done. So one of the things that's been mentioned in this amendment is about ecosystem management, and I think everybody supports that. But the reality is, and Roy emphasized it in his comment, was that we all want to do ecosystem management, but the information to get the answers to those questions is really down the pike, because there's so much more information we need and more data we need before we can start getting into these interspecies relationship that it's a long way before we're going to answer that question. But I'm glad Roy brought it up, because it really is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that comment, Jim. Appreciate it. Anyone else from the board or the council at this time? All right, one more crack at it, Tom. Go ahead.
I took my hand down.
Oh, I'm sorry. It came back up, so you might want to make sure you put it back down. It's up on my screen right now.
Okay.
There you go. That's better. Okay. Well, I think we had a good presentation from staff. Lots of good questions and comments by members of the board and the council, as well as the public. It is 11:56. I don't think taking on the alternative sets right now is probably not the best thing to do. Why don't we take a break for lunch? I think 45 minutes is probably fine. Hopefully that's okay with all of you. And why don't we get back together at 12:45, and we'll start with fishery management plan goals and objectives, and we'll start working through this document. I'll be looking for, let me just ask staff before we move on. Have you, staff, Dustin and Matt, have you guys prepared motions based on the staff recommendations at this point? Or are we going to?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mr. Chairman. I have the motions prepared based off of the council staff recommendations, and then I've also received a couple other draft motions that I do have prepared. So whenever we're ready to pull those over, you know, they'll all be on the screen, but just know that, you know, until someone makes that motion, it's not valid. It's just there as notes for everyone to use. Yeah. Okay, so what I'll do, what we'll do when we come back at 12:45 is we'll start with FMP goals and objectives, and I'll ask if there's anybody that wants to make the motion based on the staff recommendation. And if so, then that's great. We'll put that up. It'll be a starting point for the discussion, and we'll spend the afternoon working through that step by step through the alternative set. So go, everybody, enjoy your lunch, enjoy a little downtime, and we'll reconvene at 12:45. Thanks, everyone.